Julian Vance stared through the floor-to-ceiling window of his 40th floor office, but he did not see the sprawling city below. He saw only the reflection of a man trapped in a cage of his own making, a shimmering ghost overlaid on a metropolis that he supposedly commanded. The glass was cold, just like the chrome and leather that furnished the cavernous room, and just like the hollow space that had taken up residence in his chest. Pressure had become his constant companion, a dull thrum beneath the surface of his tailored suits and confident boardroom presentations. The board of directors wanted more, always more. More growth, more profit, more market dominance. They whispered about his lack of a personal life, his disinterest in the socialite circles where deals were lubricated with champagne and empty compliments. They saw it as a liability, a sign of instability in a man whose decisions controlled billions. He ran a hand over his face, the gesture weary and far older than his 34 years. His friend, the only one he trusted, had set him up on a blind date. A favor, he had called it. You need to meet someone real, Julian, Mark had insisted over the phone. Someone who doesn't know you're Julian Vance, CEO of Zenith Innovations. Someone who won't see a walking bank vault. The idea was both terrifying and strangely liberating. For one night, he could be just a man. Not a brand, not a headline, not a target. He had agreed, but on one condition. He would go as Jules, a freelance graphic designer struggling to make ends meet. He would wear old jeans and a faded jacket, drive a rented, unassuming sedan, and meet her at a place that had never seen a corporate expense account. It was a test, a cynical experiment to prove to himself that Mark was wrong, that genuine connection was a myth peddled in movies. Miles away, in a small apartment that smelled of cinnamon and old books, Alara Hayes checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. She saw a pediatric nurse, a single mother, and a woman who was still learning how to be just herself again. Rain pattered against the window pane, a gentle, rhythmic sound that usually soothed her, but tonight it felt like a soft warning. Her best friend, Chloe, had been relentless. It's been 3 years, Alara, she had said, her voice gentle but firm. Liam would want you to be happy. He would want you to live. Chloe had arranged the whole thing, a blind date with a friend of her husband's cousin. The description was vague. Jules, a creative type, a really sweet guy. There was no mention of money or status, which was a relief. Alara's life was a carefully constructed fortress of routine and love, built around her 6-year-old son, Leo. They had enough. They had their cozy home, Leo's bright laughter, and the quiet strength she had painstakingly rebuilt after Liam, her firefighter husband, had been taken from them. The thought of letting someone new into that fragile world was daunting. She took a deep breath, tucking a stray strand of brown hair behind her ear. She was not doing this for herself, not really. She was doing it to show Chloe she was trying, and perhaps to prove to the quiet, lonely woman in the mirror that she had not forgotten how to be brave. She kissed a sleeping Leo on the forehead, his small face peaceful in the dim glow of his rocket ship night light, and stepped out into the misty night, her heart a hesitant drum against her ribs. The coffee shop was a small, unassuming place called the Daily Grind, tucked between a laundromat and a used bookstore. The air inside was warm and thick with the scent of roasted beans and damp coats. Julian, feeling like an imposter in his worn-out clothes, found a small table in the corner and watched the door. Every woman who entered sent a jolt of anxiety through him. He was out of his element, stripped of his armor of wealth and power, and he felt naked. Then she walked in. She shook the rain from her simple coat, her movements unhurried and graceful. Her eyes scanned the room, a flicker of nervousness in their warm, brown depths. She was not the type of woman he was used to seeing. There was no artifice, no calculated glamour. There was just a quiet authenticity that was as startling as it was beautiful. She saw him, offered a small, tentative smile, and made her way to his table. "Jules?" she asked, her voice soft. "Alara?" he replied, standing up, his own voice sounding rough to his ears. "Yes." "Hot." They sat, and an awkward silence fell between them, punctuated by the clatter of ceramic mugs and the hiss of the espresso machine. He had orchestrated this entire scenario to feel ordinary, yet he had no idea how to navigate it. In his world, conversations were transactions, negotiations with clear objectives. This was different. This was just two people. Alara was the first to break the silence. "So, Chloe tells me you're a graphic designer," she said, her smile genuine. "That sounds fascinating. What kind of things do you create?" He stumbled through a fabricated story about designing logos for small businesses, the lie feeling heavy and clumsy on his tongue. He expected her to be bored, to look for an escape. Instead, she listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, her gaze never wavering. He found himself talking about color theory and fonts, topics he hadn't thought about since a single art class in college, and for a moment, he almost believed his own story. As they talked, he watched her. He noticed the way she cradled her mug in both hands, as if to draw warmth from it. He noticed the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, but also the deep well of kindness within them. For the first time in years, he felt himself relax, the ever-present tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. It was then that a commotion started outside the coffee shop's large front window. A well-dressed man was yelling at an elderly homeless man who was huddled in the doorway of the closed bookstore next door, trying to shelter from the persistent drizzle. The shouting was sharp and cruel, words like disgusting and get a job cutting through the cozy atmosphere of the cafe. Inside, people averted their eyes, pretending not to notice. Julian felt a familiar surge of cynicism. This was the world as he knew it, indifference punctuated by casual cruelty. He watched Alara, expecting her to do the same, to shrink into her seat and wait for the unpleasantness to pass. She did not. Her brow furrowed with concern, and the light in her eyes was replaced by a quiet fire. Without a word, she stood up from their table. Julian watched, confused, as she went to the counter. She ordered a large coffee and a hot sandwich, paying with the few bills she pulled from her purse. Then, with the warm bag in her hand, she walked to the door and stepped outside into the rain. Julian turned in his seat to watch through the window. He saw her approach the homeless man, not with pity, but with a simple, profound respect. She knelt so she was at his level, offered him the food and drink, and then simply sat with him on the damp step, speaking to him quietly. The angry man had already stormed off, but Alara remained. She did not preach or condescend. From what Julian could see, she just listened. After a few minutes, the old man was smiling, a genuine, gap-toothed grin. Alara patted his arm, stood up, and came back inside, her hair damp with mist. She slid back into her chair, a faint blush on her cheeks as she noticed Julian staring. "Sorry about that," she murmured, as if she had done something to be embarrassed about. Julian was speechless. In his world, people either ignored problems or threw money at them from a safe distance. He had never seen someone offer their time, their warmth, their dignity. It was an act of such simple, unadorned kindness that it struck him with the force of a physical blow. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question was not an accusation, but a genuine, desperate inquiry. Alara looked at him, her expression open and honest. "Because no one deserves to be invisible," she said softly, "and because everyone deserves a little warmth on a cold night." In that moment, Julian Vance's cynical experiment shattered. He had come here expecting to find proof that everyone was driven by self-interest, that kindness was a performance. Instead, he had found Alara, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he had to see her again. His carefully constructed disguise suddenly felt less like a tool and more like a cage. Their second date was a walk in the park a few days later. The autumn sun was weak but persistent, casting long shadows across the pathways littered with gold and crimson leaves. Julian had suggested it, wanting to be somewhere open, somewhere that felt more real than the curated environments he was used to. He found himself ridiculously nervous, choosing his clothes with more care than he would for a billion-dollar merger meeting. Alara was waiting for him by the duck pond, a gentle smile on her face. She was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, and she looked more beautiful to him than any of the glittering socialites he had ever escorted to galas. As they began to walk, the conversation flowed more easily than it had in the coffee shop. He told her edited truths about his life, focusing on his supposed freelance work, the long hours, the creative frustrations. She spoke about her job as a pediatric nurse, and her face lit up with a passion that was both fierce and gentle. She described the children she cared for not as patients, but as tiny, resilient warriors. She spoke of the triumphs of a child taking their first steps after surgery, and the quiet sorrow of holding a parent's hand through a difficult diagnosis. Julian listened, captivated. Her life was woven from threads of empathy and service, a stark contrast to his, which was built on acquisition and control. As they rounded a bend, they came across a small memorial bench overlooking the pond. Alara paused, her steps slowing. A small, tarnished plaque was fixed to the backrest. "My husband, Liam, loved this park," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She had not mentioned a husband before, and Julian felt a sudden, sharp pang of an emotion he couldn't name. He had assumed she was single, not widowed. "He was a firefighter," she continued, her gaze fixed on the water where a family of ducks paddled in a neat line. "He died 3 years ago, in a warehouse fire downtown. He ran back in to save a trapped colleague." She delivered the words without any plea for sympathy. It was a statement of fact, a piece of her history that she carried with a quiet grace that humbled him. She was not defined by her loss, but she had been shaped by it. It was the source of the deep well of strength he had sensed in her from the very beginning. "I'm so sorry, Alara," he said, the words feeling utterly inadequate. She turned to him, a soft, sad smile touching her lips. "Thank you. It taught me what's important. It's not the big, flashy things. It's the small moments. A shared laugh. A quiet evening. Knowing that the people you love are safe." Her words were a direct arrow into the heart of his own empty existence, filled with big, flashy things and a profound lack of everything she just described. He felt an overwhelming urge to tell her the truth, to confess his ridiculous charade. But the fear of her reaction, of her seeing him as just another rich man playing games, held him back. He was not ready to lose this fragile, budding connection that felt more real than anything in his life. So he remained Jules, the struggling artist, and simply nodded, tucking her profound wisdom away in his heart. Their third date was at her apartment. She had invited him for dinner, a brave and trusting gesture that made his stomach flutter. He arrived with a cheap bottle of wine, as Jules would, and found her in the kitchen, flour dusting her cheek, looking flustered and laughing. "I am a terrible cook," she confessed, "but my son, Leo, insisted we make you his favorite, homemade pizza." And that was how he met Leo. The little boy peeked out from behind his mother's legs, his eyes wide and curious. He was a miniature version of Alara, with the same warm eyes and serious expression. Julian, who had almost no experience with children, felt a fresh wave of anxiety. What did one say to a 6-year-old? Leo saved him the trouble. He marched forward, holding out a small, slightly sticky hand. "I'm Leo. Are you my mom's friend?" "I am," Julian said, shaking the small hand gently. "It's nice to meet you, Leo." The pizza making was a chaotic, joyful disaster. More flour ended up on the floor than in the dough. Cheese was sprinkled everywhere. Leo decided Julian's face needed a tomato sauce mustache. Through it all, Alara laughed, a sound so pure and unrestrained that Julian felt it resonate deep within him. He was not a CEO in that moment. He was just a man, covered in flour, laughing in a warm kitchen with a woman and her child. It felt more like home than his sterile penthouse ever had. While the lopsided pizzas baked, Leo tugged on Julian's sleeve. "Come see my room," he demanded. In Leo's room, drawings were taped to every wall. Rockets, dinosaurs, and stick figure families. Leo pointed to one in particular. It showed 3 figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. 2 were labeled Mom, and Leo, the third figure, taller than the rest, was unlabeled. "That's for my dad," Leo said simply. "But my mom says he's a star now." "So the spot is empty." He looked up at Julian, his expression impossibly old for a 6-year-old. "Maybe someone new will stand there one day." The innocent profundity of the statement struck Julian with incredible force. This was the empty space in their lives, the one left by a hero. And here he was, a man living a lie, standing in this sacred space. A deep sense of shame washed over him. Before they left the room, Leo reached into a small box on his dresser. He pulled out a smooth, gray stone, painted with a wobbly blue swirl. "This is a worry stone," he said, pressing it into Julian's hand. "When you're scared or sad, you hold it tight, and it makes it better. My dad gave me 1 inch." Julian closed his hand around the small, cool stone. The weight of it felt immense. It was a simple gift, a child's treasure, but it felt like the most valuable thing he had ever held. It was a token of trust, an anchor to this small, warm world he had stumbled into. As he held it, he made a silent promise. He would be worthy of this trust. He would find a way to be the man Alara and Leo deserved, not the one his bank account said he was. The illusion of his simple life as Jules was shattered a week later. The crisis did not arrive with a whisper, but with the deafening roar of a corporate implosion. Julian walked into his office at Zenith Innovations to find his senior team in a state of controlled panic. Their stock was in freefall. "What's happening?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the tension. His chief legal officer pointed to a tablet. The screen was filled with headlines from every major financial news outlet. Zenith CEO Julian Vance under fire for unethical practices. Whistleblower exposes corruption at tech giant. Vance's empire on the brink of collapse. The articles were a brutal mix of half-truths and outright fabrications, painting him as a ruthless tyrant who cut corners, exploited workers, and manipulated market data. The details were too specific, too intimate. This was not a random attack. This was a betrayal from within. It did not take long to identify the source. Marcus Thorne, his ambitious and resentful second-in-command, the man he had once considered a protégé. Marcus had been feeding this poison to the press for weeks, carefully crafting a narrative that would not only destroy Julian, but also clear a path for his own hostile takeover. The board convened an emergency meeting. The room was thick with fear and accusation. Their advice was swift and brutal. "Go on the offensive," the chairman said, his voice cold as steel. "Use our legal team to bury him. Unearth every piece of dirt on Marcus and anyone associated with him. Ruin them. We leak our own stories, control the narrative. This is war, Julian. We have to be ruthless." The old Julian would have agreed without hesitation. He had built his empire on such tactics. He knew how to fight, how to win at any cost. But as he sat there, listening to the talk of character assassination and scorched earth strategies, he felt a profound sense of revulsion. He thought of Alara, of her simple, unwavering decency. He thought of her kneeling on a wet sidewalk to offer a stranger some warmth. He clutched the worry stone in his pocket. Its smooth surface was a tangible link to the man he wanted to become. Could he order his lawyers to destroy people, to potentially ruin the lives of innocent employees who might get caught in the crossfire of a corporate war, and then go and sit in Alara's warm kitchen? The two worlds could no longer coexist. He had to choose. The choice felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. On one side was everything he had ever known: power, wealth, control, the ruthless logic of survival. On the other side was a terrifying, unknown path paved with vulnerability and integrity, a path that would likely lead to the loss of his company and his fortune. It was a choice between his empire and his soul. Overwhelmed and suffocated by the pressure, he fled the office late that night. He drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring through his windshield. He found himself parked outside Alara's apartment building, the windows of her small home glowing with a soft, inviting light. He did not know why he was there, only that it was the one place in the world that felt safe. He went to her door, his suit disheveled, his face a mask of exhaustion and despair. When she opened it, her smile faded into a look of deep concern. He looked broken, a man hollowed out from the inside. "Jules? What is it? What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with alarm. He could not bring himself to tell her the whole truth. The lie was too big, the reality too far from the simple world he had shared with her. "I'm in trouble, Alara," he managed to say, his voice cracking. "My business. There are problems. People I trusted. They're trying to ruin me." She did not press for details. She did not ask questions he could not answer. She simply took his hand, her touch a steady anchor in his swirling vortex of fear. "Come in," she said softly. She led him to her small, comfortable sofa. She made him a cup of tea, her movements calm and reassuring. She sat with him, not filling the silence with empty platitudes, but simply sharing the space with him, offering her quiet, unwavering presence. After a long time, he finally looked at her, his eyes pleading for something he could not articulate. "They want me to fight back in a way that... It's not right. It could hurt people who don't deserve it. But if I don't, I'll lose everything I've ever built." Alara looked at him, her gaze clear and direct. She reached out and placed her hand over his, which was clenched into a tight fist on his knee. "You might lose what you've built," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But you won't lose who you are. Your integrity is worth more than any business, Jules. You still have your spine. That's the one thing they can't take from you." Her words were not advice. They were an affirmation. She saw the good in him, the man he was struggling to be beneath the layers of cynicism and ambition. Her simple, unconditional faith in his character was the most powerful thing he had ever experienced. In that moment, the choice became clear. He would not become the monster they expected him to be. He would face this crisis as the man Alara believed he was. He would lose his empire if he had to, but he would not lose himself. The following morning, Julian Vance walked back into the headquarters of Zenith Innovations, a changed man. The exhaustion was still etched on his face, but the despair had been replaced by a quiet, resolute calm. He bypassed the frantic war room his legal team had set up and called an all-hands meeting for the entire company, to be followed immediately by a press conference. His board was apoplectic. "This is suicide," the chairman hissed into his phone. "You're handing them the knife to slit your own throat, Julian." "Perhaps," Julian replied calmly. "But I'd rather face the consequences of the truth than live with the victory of a lie." He stood before his thousands of employees, the cameras of the world's media waiting just outside. He wore the same suit as the day before, a subtle sign that this was not a performance. This was a reckoning. He did not use a teleprompter or prepared notes. He simply spoke from the heart. "There have been stories in the news about this company and about me," he began, his voice steady. "And while many of them are filled with distortions and falsehoods, they are not entirely without merit." A shocked murmur rippled through the auditorium. "In our aggressive pursuit of growth, we have made mistakes. We have prioritized profits over people at times. I have personally fostered a culture that was too focused on winning and not focused enough on how we won. For that, I take full responsibility, and I am deeply sorry." He went on to outline the specific, real mistakes the company had made, the ones Marcus had twisted in his smear campaign. He did not make excuses. He owned every single one. Then, he laid out a new path forward, a plan for radical transparency, improved employee benefits, and the creation of an independent ethics committee. Finally, he addressed the betrayal. These truths were brought to light in a malicious way by an individual who sought to profit from our downfall, he said, and for the first time, an image appeared on the screen behind him. It was not dirt on Marcus, but irrefutable evidence of his stock manipulation and communication with rival companies. "Mr. Thorne's actions will be handled by the proper authorities, but his betrayal does not negate our responsibility. It only highlights the urgent need for change." He ended not with a plea for their loyalty, but with a promise. "I cannot guarantee that Zenith will survive this storm, but I can guarantee that for as long as I am leading it, we will operate with the integrity you all deserve. We will be a company we can all be proud of, not just for what we build, but for how we build it." He stepped away from the podium, accepting no questions. He had laid his cards on the table. The fate of his company, his fortune, and his reputation was now in the hands of others. He felt strangely light, as if he had shed an immense weight. He had accepted the consequences, whatever they might be. The immediate aftermath was chaos. But then, something remarkable happened. The narrative began to shift. Employees started posting messages of support on social media. His shocking honesty resonated with a public weary of corporate doublespeak. Commentators who had been calling for his head a day earlier were now praising his courage. The stock, after an initial final dip, began to stabilize. His act of integrity, which his advisors had called career suicide, had become his salvation. The board, seeing the tide turn, unanimously voted to support him and formally ousted Marcus, who now faced serious federal investigation. Julian did not stay to celebrate. He did not watch the news reports or track the stock price. As soon as he left the stage, he went straight to the one place that mattered. He drove to Alara's apartment, his heart pounding with a new kind of fear, the fear of telling her the biggest truth of all. She opened the door, her face showing that she had seen the news. He saw confusion, shock, but not the anger he had dreaded. He stood on her doorstep, no longer Jules the designer, but Julian Vance, the Millionaire CEO he had tried to hide. "I have to tell you everything," he said, his voice raw. They sat on her sofa, the same sofa where she had comforted him just the night before. He told her everything. He told her about his cynicism, his loneliness, the cynical experiment that had led him to her. He told her about the lie he had maintained, a lie born of a desperate desire to be seen for who he was, not what he had. He laid his entire, complicated, messy truth at her feet, fully expecting her to ask him to leave. When he finished, silence filled the room. Alara was quiet for a long time, her gaze thoughtful. He held his breath, bracing for the verdict. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft. "I didn't fall for Jules, the graphic designer," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "I fell for the man who was awkward and kind, who listened when I spoke, who made my son laugh so hard he snorted milk out of his nose. I fell for the man who carried a painted rock in his pocket because he was afraid of losing himself." Tears welled in his eyes, tears of profound, overwhelming relief. She was not angry. She understood. She had seen past the disguise from the very beginning, not because she knew his secret, but because she saw his heart. "The name and the job. That's just noise, Julian," she continued, a small, gentle smile forming on her lips. "I saw you, the real you, and that's the person I want in my life." He reached out and took her hands, his grip tight. The crisis was over. The company was saved. But this, right here, was the real victory. This quiet moment of acceptance, this shared understanding in a small, warm living room. Their bond, forged in a lie but solidified by truth and tested by fire, was now unbreakable. 1 year later, the rain was falling again, but this time it felt different. It was a cleansing sound, washing the city streets clean as Julian stood beside Alara, looking out at the world they were building together. The sterile penthouse was a distant memory, sold along with the ostentatious lifestyle it represented. A significant portion of the proceeds had been used to establish the Liam Hayes Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting the families of fallen first responders. Their new home was a comfortable house on a quiet, tree-lined street. It was filled with light, laughter, and the happy clutter of family life. Leo's drawings were taped to the large refrigerator, and the faint smell of cinnamon and old books seemed to have followed them from Alara's apartment. It was a home, not just a house. Julian's transformation was profound. He still ran Zenith, but it was a different company. The new ethics committee he had established was now a model for the industry. Employee satisfaction was at an all-time high. He had discovered that integrity was not just good for the soul, it was good for business. But his real passion was the foundation. He had traded his corner office for a small, humble room they had set up in their home, where he and Alara worked side by side, managing grants and developing support programs. He was no longer just a CEO. He was now a man who attended parent-teacher conferences, coached Leo's soccer team, and was still a disastrous, but enthusiastic, pizza maker. He had traded a life of isolated grandeur for one of messy, beautiful connection. The hollow space in his chest had been filled. Today was a significant day. It was the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the first community center funded by their foundation. The center offered grief counseling, financial planning, and childcare for families who had lost a loved one in the line of duty. It was a place of healing, a testament to Liam's legacy and the new purpose that guided their lives. The ceremony was small and heartfelt. Local officials and recipient families gathered under a large tent to stay dry. Alara gave a moving speech, her voice filled with quiet strength and empathy. Then, to everyone's surprise, Leo, now 7 years old, asked if he could say something. He clutched a small index card in his hand and walked bravely to the podium. He looked out at the small crowd, his eyes finding his mother's, and then Julian's. "My first dad was a hero," he began, his small voice clear and strong. "He saved people. This building helps the families of heroes, and that's good." He took a deep breath. "And I want to thank my mom for being the best mom ever. And I want to thank my dad, Julian, for helping build this." The word hung in the air. Dad. It was the first time Leo had used it. A collective, gentle gasp went through the audience. Julian felt the world stop for a moment. His eyes met Alara's, and he saw the same joyful, tear-filled shock reflected there. He looked at Leo, who was now beaming at him from the podium, and his heart felt like it might burst. This small boy, with his profound innocence, had just given him the most important title of his life. It was not CEO. It was Dad. Later that evening, the house was quiet. Leo was asleep, the triumphant hero of the day. Alara was reading in an armchair, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating her peaceful face. Julian found himself standing by the living room window, watching the rain streak down the glass. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, painted worry stone. Its blue swirl had faded slightly from a year of being held in anxious hands and hopeful moments. It was his most prized possession. Alara came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his back. "What are you thinking about?" she whispered. He turned in her embrace, holding up the stone for her to see. "I was just thinking about how this small rock is heavier than my entire former life." He then gently took her hand and turned his own over, revealing a faint, silvery scar that cut across his palm. "I've never shown this to anyone," he said softly. "I was 7. I fell out of a tree and landed on a piece of broken glass. I was alone and so scared. For years, I was ashamed of it. A sign of weakness." Alara looked at the scar, her expression full of a love so deep it took his breath away. She leaned in and pressed her lips to it, a gesture of such profound acceptance that it healed a wound far older and deeper than the one on his skin. She was kissing the part of him that was scared and alone and telling it that it was safe now. "You are home, Julian Vance," she whispered against his palm. He pulled her close, his heart overflowing. He was no longer a ghost in a glass tower. He was a man firmly planted on the ground, held fast by the love of his chosen family. Holding her hand, with the worry stone still warm in his other, he looked out the window not at a city to be conquered, but at a quiet street where a little boy was dreaming, safe in his bed. He had found that true worth was not measured in dollars, but in the small, quiet moments of grace, and that the strongest family was the one you were brave enough to build.